Starring Matt's evil twin and original Matt, it's everyone's favorite buddy sitcom, OET!
Hey, D. What you watching there? Have you seen this show? What, The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt? The show about the girl who was kidnapped in the 90s and forced to live in an underground bunker for 15 years until she was rescued and decided she wanted to live a normal adult life in New York City? Yeah. Of course I've seen it. I introduced you to it. You like it? How could you not like this? It's delightful. Yeah, of course I like it. I just didn't really think it was your thing. Hey now, there's more to me than just evil and plotting and darkness. I'm a complex character, Matt. I have layers. How much coffee have you had today? Just a couple. Bags. OET. You realize this is a sitcom, right? Say what now? A sitcom. You know, situation comedy. Television show made up of short episodes, usually about 20-25 minutes long, following the same group of characters in different situations with humorous results. Yeah, I know what a sitcom is. I review television, remember? Besides, Kimmy Schmidt isn't just any sitcom, it's... What? You're about to get me to do a review, aren't you? It looks that way. On sitcoms. Better than your television intro video. So, sitcoms have been around for decades, and in a lot of ways they're kind of the backbone of American television. I can't really speak for other nationalities. They were a part of television's early days, they were a part of television's predecessor, the radio, and it doesn't look like they're going anywhere anytime soon. At best, they're viewed as fun, humorous, and generally lighthearted stories where we get to know a group of characters over time in various situations, and at worst they're viewed as largely insubstantial, mindless entertainment. Basically, the sitcom is like the hamburger of television. You see them around everywhere, they're maybe not the most healthy thing in the world for you, and they can either be the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, depending on who made it. But what exactly are we talking about here? Because sitcom is one of those classifications that's kind of hard to define. There's definitely a typical structure and certain expectations that come with watching a sitcom. For a long time, sitcoms are filmed on a soundstage with multiple cameras set up, often before a live studio audience, but regardless, almost always with some sort of laugh track in the background. Episodes tended to be around 22 minutes in length, usually in 5 or 6 acts to allow for commercial breaks, stretching out the format to half an hour. The stories followed the same group of characters, crossing over from episode to episode, in various situations, usually humorous and easily resolvable within the 22-minute format. And in a lot of cases, these situations were self-contained and didn't affect the other episodes in the series. And the only reason I go into all of that explanation is because sitcoms aren't always like that anymore. Sitcoms sometimes don't use a live studio audience or a laugh track, they're not filmed on a sound stage and use a single camera setup, being filmed more like a movie than a stage production. Some sitcoms are animated, rendering both of the previous points moot, and there's some debate as to whether we should even call these shows sitcoms or whether they should fall into some other classification like dramedy or mockumentary. But for our definition, we're going to focus less on the format and more on story. Most early sitcoms tried to keep things relatively simple with their group of characters. To that end, they tried to put their characters in environments where it made sense to see the same characters day after day, and those environments tended to fall into 2 categories: workplace sitcoms and home or family-based sitcoms. In workplace sitcoms, we follow a group of co-workers and see how they do their jobs and deal with the sorts of situations that you would find in the workplace, in humorous fashion. In family or home-based sitcoms, we might look at a married couple, sometimes their kids, sometimes their parents, sometimes their friends and neighbors, but always revolving around the home. in humorous fashion. Not only does this make it easier to follow a similar group of characters, but it also gives us a nice familiar social bubble to relate to. However, some sitcoms blur the line between home and work, sometimes by showing us both of them in equal measure, or sometimes by taking us out of those bubbles completely and putting us in a new situation, the social situation. Showing our characters out in the world outside of their home and their work and dealing with situations out there, what I like to call real-world sitcoms. These sitcoms often show us 20 or 30-somethings trying to deal with a world that isn't always clearly defined. And there is naturally humor in these shows, but there is also a certain amount of poignancy in them as we see adults trying to deal with something that is probably the most relatable situation. Trying to be adults. So let's take a look at how this format has evolved over the decades by looking at one particular sitcom for each decade, starting with the 50s. The 50s brought us one of the most defining television shows in not just the world of sitcoms, but in the world of television in general. I Love Lucy. Now this show is primarily a home sitcom revolving around Lucy and her life as a housewife. But much of the humor of this show revolves around her desire to be a part of the club and the shows where her husband Ricky acts as band leader. As such, Ricky's job is very much central to the show, but the two are very much at odds with each other, and in the end, I Love Lucy is much more of a home and family type sitcom. A decade later, in the 60s, we have the Dick Van Dyke Show, but you get a much better sense of the home-work dichotomy in this show in its original title, Head of the Family. Rod Petrie, the show's main protagonist, is shown in equal measure in his home life and his work life. In fact, the other 4 members of the supporting cast are evenly split between his co-workers, played by Rose Marie and Maury Amsterdam, and his wife and son, played by Mary Tyler Moore and Larry Matthews. Now, the only reason I mentioned these 2 particular sitcoms is because they act as kind of the foundation for the other 5 sitcoms that I want to talk about that do delve more deeply into this new category of sitcom, the real-world sitcom. True, these 2 sitcoms did do things a little bit differently, but they did basically stay true to the sitcom format. Then we got into the 70s with a sitcom that was groundbreaking in many ways, The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Perhaps most notably, the main character in this show is Mary Richard, an unmarried woman in her 30s who, though she has a number of romantic relationships throughout the run of the show, remains unmarried by the end of the series and seems satisfied to remain so. Mary proves herself to be a career-driven woman and isn't necessarily looking to settle down and be a wife and a mother, which was unusual for a leading lady at that time. The whole premise of the show is Mary trying to make it in a new life, moving across the country to a place she's unfamiliar with and landing a job as an associate producer for a local news show. And you could argue that this is a workplace sitcom, as much of the show and characters do revolve around Mary's workplace in the news studio, and Mary lives alone and doesn't really have a traditional home and family to make a sitcom out of. But much like the Dick Van Dyke Show, this show focuses on Mary's whole life. How she fits in at work, how she interacts with her friends and neighbors, the people that she dates, and the life that she lives in her off hours. Her work is a big part of that, of course, but only in as much as it is a big part of her life. And much of the focus of that aspect of the show is how Mary's co-workers become something like a second family, people with their own life and issues outside of the office. And though a lot of the humor and stories come from workplace-related situations, a lot of them come from real-life situations as well, including weighty issues like how to deal with death and divorce and the prospect of losing one's job. And then we go into the 80s with another sitcom that very much defined the genre at that time, Cheers. Cheers could also be argued as a workplace sitcom, as it does take place mostly in this bar, and the main characters are employees of the bar. But just like the Mary Tyler Moore Show, many of the situations are focused less around bar and work-related situations as they are around life situations. The bar simply serves as a backdrop for where people can go to get away from the real world for a while, as it says in the opening title sequence. And as the series progressed, we saw more and more of the real world creep into these storylines, once again showing how these characters reacted to these situations. It very much takes the idea of a bar as being a place where people either go to get away from or talk about their troubles and runs with it. Originally, the show was meant to just focus around the 4 employees of the bar, but as the show became fully realized, the regular patrons of the bar became regular characters in the show as well, and very much became the heart of the show in their own way. Characters like Cliff, the know-it-all mailman, Frasier, who got his own spin-off show, and of course... But even the people who work at the bar have their own life troubles that they have to talk through as well. As time went on, something of a dichotomy started to develop between 2 different classes, the working class and the more elite educated, a dichotomy that was demonstrated early on in the on-again, off-again relationship between Sam Malone and Diane Chambers, a relationship that often strained against this class dichotomy. And though Cheers was meant to be an escape from the real world, oftentimes the real world just seeped into this environment. Often to the point where it was a little strange to even call this show a comedy, and it started to drift towards the more ambiguous genre of dramedy. And then of course we have the 90s, and we can't very well talk about the 90s and real-world sitcoms without talking about... Unlike the other sitcoms that we've already talked about, Friends really can't be misconstrued as a work-related sitcom. Yes, all the characters have jobs, and we see them in their jobs, and oftentimes their jobs even enter into the story, but there's no one workplace that acts as a central hub for all these characters to get into workplace-related situations. Unless you count the coffee shop where Rachel works and they all hang out, but even then, that's not really a work environment, that's a social environment. A place where these friends can get together and spend time together. Similarly, the characters were very intentional in that there not be one person to act as the main focal character. Rather, the 6 main characters are all portrayed more or less equally, the very definition of an ensemble story. Much like Cheers, this story is about a group of young adults just trying to make it in the world, trying to navigate work, relationship, family, and of course, friends in an adult world. The situations are very much real-world situations, though simplified and played up for comedy, of course. And it's the socialization and the friendship between these 6 characters that acts as the focal point of the story, as opposed to any one particular environment. Love it or hate it, Friends definitely defined the directions that sitcoms would take over the next couple of decades, and indeed, many of the sitcoms of the 90s and early 2000s focus more on this social interaction, this socialization between friends, as opposed to a work or a home environment. But in the 2000s, we saw another sitcom, which many accused of being a Friends knockoff, but which actually took the genre in a slightly different direction. In 2005, we were introduced to the small social group of How I Met Your Mother. And on the surface, this has the same basic premise as Friends, a social group of 20-somethings trying to navigate the adult world, maintain and further their careers and relationships, and in general just try to deal with very adult issues. The main difference, of course, is that there is a very planned, overarching storyline surrounding the whole thing. Each episode is one part of a very long story that is being told by the middle-aged Ted Mosby to his children of how he met their mother. And through that story, we learn how Ted and his friends learned how to adult in the real world. Now, of course, there's progression and character development in the other shows that we've talked about as well, but remember when Haberdasher talked about how we've really come to love convoluted and complex storylines? Well, that doesn't end with sci-fi and fantasy. With Him, we see that that has crept into the world of sitcoms as well. Each season is meticulously planned out, and we might see something happen in an episode that we won't get a context for until later, or something might happen that seems completely inconsequential but turns out to be deeply meaningful in some way. And one of the things about watching Him, other than spending time with these very likable characters, is watching the puzzle pieces slowly start to fit together in this very, very long story. Also, because the story is being told secondhand, and because it's a father telling it to his children, there's kind of an understanding that the things that he's talking about might not necessarily be as true to the real world as they might be. And then, finally, we arrive in the 2010s and the unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, which takes a different twist on the genre, but is still at its heart this same idea. Here we have Kimmy, who was kidnapped and forced to live in an underground bunker when she was in middle school, believing the world to have ended. 15 years later, she was rescued and then had to learn how to live as an adult 20-something in the real modern world, not being satisfied to just coast as one of the famous mole women. So the circumstances are different, but the main idea is still the same. Kimmy has to learn how to navigate jobs and relationships and various other things in the adult world. And it's not just her either. All 4 of the main characters in this show have to go through this on some level. Titus has to deal with being very talented but largely unnoticed, and having to balance his own ideal dream of being a star with the practical reality of paying the bills. Lillian has to deal with a world that is rapidly changing in ways that she doesn't want it to. And Jacqueline has to learn how to be a functioning adult in the real world after living most of her adult life being arm candy to her rich husband. And just like with Himium, there is an overarching story that develops throughout the series with these characters. Additionally, because this is a Netflix original, it's not constrained by a network structure. It doesn't have to fit commercial breaks and various acts and scenes into its format. It can move at the pace that it needs to tell its story. So between Mary and Kimmy, the format has definitely evolved, but there's definitely also a through line through all of these as we watch various characters try to figure out how to be an adult in an often unfriendly world. And they might just make it after all, but making your way in the world today takes everything you've got, and no one told them life was gonna be this way. It's gonna be, fascinating transition. Ba 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 ba. Ba ba ba. The point is that sitcoms tried to find familiarity and relatability in the social bubbles of work and home. But they also tried to find familiarity in the more ambiguous and yet somehow more familiar realm of the real world. And it gives us hope that maybe we can make it in the adult world too. That maybe we can be like Mary or Sam or Rachel or Ted or Kimmy and carry on in spite of adversity. That's really what makes these shows successful. Yes, the jokes are funny enough, but it's really the characters and the stories that we come back for, and how they're able to get through and often even make light of rough situations. Maybe these real-world situations make these shows less comedic, but they also make them more relatable and, I would argue, more watchable. What? Oh, nothing. I just, I wouldn't have thought this, hopefulness would have really been your thing. You're right. That's not consistent with my character at all. I guess there's only one explanation. What's that? This is all a dream. Still don't understand how you can sleep so much when you're already technically asleep. Fighting against the apathy. Anyway, I think I'll stay awake for the time being, if that's the kind of dreams I'm gonna be having. Yeah. Your laughter was weirdly mechanical and forced. You ever gonna write me back into the story? I'd prefer not to just hang out here for the rest of it. Also, when are they gonna land in a new genre anyway? It seems like you're dragging out the story on purpose. I've got setup to do, E.T. I can't just let things happen just because. There's gotta be a reason for it. If I put you back in the story now, it won't make sense. I have to wait for the right moment. Otherwise, I hear you talking and everything, but all I really hear is blah, blah, blah. Don't forget the twin.